Hello everyone, how are you? Today we're gonna model this scene from scratch. I'm gonna cover every single step and I will also show you some variations for some materials, for the lighting and for the rendering. I might have talked a bit too fast in this video, but remember you can always pause it and I used very simple techniques, so I'm sure you'll be able to follow along. And no, I haven't forgotten about the second part of my building animation series, but I'm still editing all that footage. Okay, let's begin. Let's start with the UV sphere and change the segments to 24. Shade smooth and in edit mode enable proportional editing. Select the top middle and the bottom middle vertices and scale on the Z-axis. Remember you can control the influence of the proportional editing tool with the mouse wheel or with the page up and page down keys. Now select this middle edge loop and scale up a bit until the sphere looks rounder. Now select every 3 edge loops. Select an edge loop, leave 2 edge loops unselected and select another one. And let's scale. Play with the influence of the proportional editing until it looks kinda like a pumpkin. You can make the ribs more or less pronounced. Bevel just a little bit and let's scale a bit more. Now disable proportional editing and scale a bit more. Let's take a look. I think the ribs look a bit too pronounced and I don't want that, so let's enable proportional editing again and scale up a bit so the ribs look a bit less pronounced. Remember to play around with the influence until you find the right look. Back to offset mode, Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision modifier, and now let's add a cylinder for the stem. Add a subdivision modifier, shade smooth. Let's move it up and in edit mode add a loop cut, escape to place it right in the middle, and now select the top and the bottom face. Remember to disable proportional editing and I to inset face. Inset again, let's show the pumpkin again, A to select all and scale down. Let's scale it down a bit more and move it on top of the pumpkin. I want it to be a bit smaller and move down a bit more. Now select the top faces, enable proportional editing and scale down a bit. Let's decrease the influence, move it up a bit on the Z-axis and rotate. Let's extrude and scale down. And here we have the stem. Remember to set the origin to geometry. And now let's add another cylinder for the legs. Add a subdivision modifier, shade smooth. Let's move it down and in edit mode add a loop cut and escape. I want to add 3 cuts, and again let's select the top and the bottom face. Inset face, A to select all, disable proportional editing and scale down. Let's move it up to place it, scale it a bit more, and move it to one side. Let's scale it a bit more until you find the right size. Add a mirror modifier so we don't need to model another leg, and move the legs to the back a bit. And let's scale them on the Z-axis to make them longer and move them on the X-axis to separate the legs a bit from each other. Now let's add a cube for the shoes. In edit mode, scale it down and move it down. Let's scale it just a bit more and place it where one of the legs is. Select the bottom face and move it up on the Z-axis to make the cube shorter. Select all and move down a bit and to the front. Select the back face and extrude. Let's move it on the Y-axis a bit. Select this top face, extrude up, and let's make this front face a bit shorter. Back to object mode, let's add a subdivision modifier, shade smooth, and let's go back to edit mode to refine the shape. Add a loop cut at the top, and now let's select this loop of faces and extrude along normals and choose how wide you want this part to be. Now let's enable X-ray mode, select all these faces and move up on the Z-axis so the shoe is a bit shorter, and move it on the Y-axis just a tiny bit. Add a loop cut right here at the bottom, and now add another loop cut here in the middle. Select this face and move it up on the Z-axis. And now let's place this shoe. Move it up a bit. Let's center it. and we need a mirror modifier. As you can see, we need the shoes to be a bit bigger, so in Edit Mode, enable X-Ray Mode, select all these back faces and move on the Y-axis. I feel like this part is a bit too big, so AI to deselect all so we don't select other faces by mistake. Select this loop of faces and scale down. And here we have our shoes. Okay, now for the eyes, let's add a UV sphere, rotate it 90 degrees on the X-axis and scale it down. Move it to the front and in Edit Mode, let's delete half of the faces. Back to Object Mode, shade Smooth and let's scale it a bit. Now scale it on the Y-axis to make it a bit flatter and place it. Let's move it to one side, let's move it up a bit, and I want it to be a bit smaller and rotate it until it matches the shape of the pumpkin. I'm gonna move it a bit to the inside of the pumpkin and we need a mirror modifier. Set the pumpkin as the mirror object and let's finish placing it. To create the mouth, add a torus, rotate it 90 degrees on the X-axis, let's scale it down and move it to the front. Shade Smooth and in Edit Mode, let's delete half of the faces. Now select this edge loop and F to fill. Select this edge loop and fill. Now select these two faces, insert face, move up a bit, scale a bit, insert face again, move up a bit again, and scale. Add a subdivision modifier, and now select these two edge loops and scale down a bit. The pivot point is set to individual origins, by the way. Let's scale it down and now scale it on the Z-axis and place it. I want the mouth to be a bit thicker, so let's add a solidify modifier. Set the offset to 1 and let's add a bit of thickness. Move it up and one last touch-up. To create the iris, Shift T to duplicate these spheres and escape. Scale them down, move them on the Y-axis to the front, and in Edit Mode, select everything and you could move the eyes towards the center to make a cross-eyed character, or you could move them outwards depending on how you like the eyes to look. I prefer them to be centered. To create the vine where the stem is, select it, Shift S and cursor to selected. And now let's add a plane. In Edit Mode, make sure the entire plane is selected and merge at center. Let's enable X-Ray Mode. And now if we change to Vertex Selection Mode, we're gonna see a vertex right here. A to select it and let's move it. I'm gonna use the annotation tool to draw the shape I want. This is just a visual help. Let's move the vertex and extrude, move the cursor, left click and extrude again. Use the shape we drew as a reference and let's complete the entire doodle. Delete the annotation, and back to Object Mode, convert this mesh into a curve. Now we have a Curve Properties tab and we can add some depth to give some volume to the curve. Shade Smooth and let's also add a subdivision modifier. To make the end thinner, select this endpoint and Alt S. And let's do the same with the first point. Let's move this one a bit, and now I'm gonna move the points that are overlapping. Simply move them on the Y-axis to either the front or the back. Let's make it a bit thicker. And now that the curve is thicker, I feel some points are too close to each other, so I'm gonna separate some of them. Take all the time you need until you're happy with the shape. Okay, now for the lips, let's add another plane, and in edit mode, let's scale it on the x-axis, scale it, and let's move it to the side and scale it on the y-axis. Add 2 loop cuts, select the bottom points and scale them a bit. Now select the top points and scale them a bit more. Now select these middle points and scale them a bit. I want this to be a bit closer to each other. And now select both the bottom and the top points and move them on the z-axis. Move the bottom points closer to the mesh, and let's do the same with the top vertices. Add a loop cut right in the middle, select these 2 middle vertices and bevel. Add 2 segments, and now select this vertex and double shift to move it closer to the bottom vertex, and do the same with this one, but take it closer to the top vertex. Now select these 2 middle vertices and move them down on the z-axis. Select the bottom vertices again, and because of the loop cuts we added in the middle, now we have to change the pivot point to medium point so we can scale the vertices closer to each other. Back to object mode, add a solidify modifier, let's set the offset to 1, add some thickness, and add a subdivision modifier. Shape smooth, and here we have our leaf. Let's do a small touch-up, disable the solidify modifier so we can see better in edit mode, and move this vertex closer to the bottom and move this one closer to the top. Select these 2 middle vertices and move them down a bit. Okay, now let's set the origin to geometry, and since we have the 3D cursor where the stem is, simply set the selection to cursor to place it faster. Scale it a bit, and here just take your time to place the leaf where you want it to be. I want the origin to be at the bottom, so in edit mode, select this bottom vertex and cursor to selected. Back to object mode, origin to 3D cursor, and now it's easier to move the leaf. Shift T to duplicate it, escape. To place the leaf faster, select the vine, in edit mode, choose the point where you want the second leaf to be, cursor to selected, and back to object mode, select the leaf and selection to cursor. Rotate it, scale it a bit. Then I decided to change the geometry of this leaf, add a loop cut right in the middle, scale it up a bit, and move it up to bend it a bit more. Select the top vertices and move them closer to the mesh. Select these 2 vertices and scale them down, and I'm gonna do the same with this. I feel the lips would look more stylized if they were a bit thicker. I changed the offset to -1, I think that looked better, and do the same with the other one. I scaled some vertices again until I was happy with the shape, and I moved them a bit. I rotated the lips so they were more visible from front view. Finally, here are my final values for the placement of the lips in case you want to copy them. Now let's dive into texturing. I'm gonna disable both the lights and the scene world, and I chose this default HDRI to work on the shaders. For the pumpkin, I started with the principled BSDF and add a color ramp. Let's move the color stops. And now add a layer weight node connected from the facing socket. As you can see, now one color is at the center and the other one is on the borders. Let's choose our colors now. I'm gonna go with the bright orange and with a bit of a darker orange. Change the interpolation to V-spline so the color transition is a bit smoother, and pick the final placement of the colors. And now select these 2 nodes, duplicate them, and this is an effect you might not like, so you can skip it. Select the color ramp and backspace to reset it and plug it into the specular socket. Change it to constant, and as you can see, what this does is give sunshine to the borders. And I'm gonna show you how it looks in Cycles because I rendered this character in Cycles, but you could work in Eevee as well. I will show you how to render in Eevee real quick at the end of this video. And this is how the effect looks. Let's see without. You can try different HDRIs. This one looks pretty nice too with the backlight. I'm gonna go back to the previous one. I used this default HDRI to light the scene. I'm gonna show you how later in the video. And when you move the character, the view or the light, the ring also moves. Remember, you can adjust it by moving the white color stop. And you can use the same nodes but with the opposite colors on the color ramp and plug it into the roughness instead to get this effect. Let's undo this and choose the same material for the legs. Okay, now for the iris, I'm just gonna make a new material. Let's rename it real quick. And I'm just gonna choose a dark color and I'm gonna take the roughness to 0 and I'm gonna crank up the specular. Add a new material for the eyes as well. Leave this default color and take the specular up and the roughness down. For the mouth, I'm gonna use the same material as the iris. And now for the stem, I have a principled PSDF, add a color ramp, and add a noise texture node. Make sure the color ramp is connected from the color socket, otherwise it won't work. And now let's just move our color stops until we like what we see, and now we can play with the scale of the noise texture depending on how big or small you want the spots to be. Let's change it to V-spline to make it a bit softer and let's choose the colors. I chose a green and a yellow color to kinda make it feel like the colors are changing because it's autumn. And I chose the same material for both the lips and the vein. You could choose 2 green shades instead, or you could even create a new material for the lips and choose a different noise number to create smaller or bigger spots, or you can even get rid of that node and make the lips completely green. And even if it doesn't look very realistic, I decided to make this material a bit shiny, just to make it look cartoonish. For the boots, I chose a yellow color. I also wanted the boots to be a bit shiny, so I played with the specular and the roughness settings, and then to make them look a bit less plain and simple, I decided to add a color ramp and a noise texture node. Let's choose our scale and move the color stops until you like the way the spots look. And I went with a bit of a less saturated yellow. And for the second color, I decided to sample the same color that I had chosen in the first place. You could even go for a more realistic approach and search for how to make more realistic rubber boots and maybe add some scratches or dirt. But again, this was a stylized character, so I decided to go with simple materials. For the lighting, I used the same default HDRI that I had used while I was working on the shaders. And to use an HDRI for the lighting only, you'll need these nodes. There are many tutorials on how to do this, but it's pretty self-explanatory. And to get this default HDRI, I searched for it in this Blender folder. So here I have the lighting on one side and the world color on the other. You could also add a mapping node to rotate the HDRI and get different lighting. I also used this default light, I left it as it was. Here it is the HDRI only, and here the HDRI with that point light. This light did give me some artifacts to the eyes, but you can erase those in an image editing software real quick. Then I decided to disable cast shadows for this light, and here's the difference between cast shadows enabled and cast shadows disabled. Then I placed the camera. First, I changed the focal length to 90mm, then I chose my view and Ctrl-Alt-0. Later, I enabled depth of field to blur both the backgrounds and the objects that were closer to the camera. I chose the pumpkin as the focus object and I set my aperture to 1.8. If you're planning on rendering in Eevee, you might want to choose a bigger number. Then I chose 12 blades and 3 for the ratio. And here it wasn't that notorious because I didn't have lots of elements in the background. I actually have a video where I explain how to get an anamorphic look with these settings, but I recommend you watch that video and maybe you will do something different with the background for this project. Then for the heel, I started with a cube, I subdivided it, and then in edit mode I simply changed the shape a little bit until it looked kinda like a heel in camera view. For the material, I used a principled BSDS and a color ramp. I used a mapping node so I could rotate the gradients, and I chose a brown and a green color. And I set the specular to 0 and the roughness to 1. For the background, I added a pretty big plane and I used a principled BSDF, a Voronoi texture and a color ramp node. I chose a turquoise color and a light blue color. Then I added another Voronoi texture node and another color ramp, and I used the same values for both Voronoi nodes, and I plugged it into the emission socket, and this made some parts a bit brighter. For the leaves, I simply duplicated 2 leaves from the pumpkin, and I placed them close to the camera so they were blurred, and remember that the focal point is set to the pumpkin, so the further away from the pumpkin, either to the back or to the front, the more blurred it will be. Of course, I did all of these changes in render preview mode to see how blurred the objects were going to be in the final render. But if I screen record while in render mode, render starts lagging. For the materials, I started with the same material as the stem, but I chose a bit of a less saturated green color because it looked too vibrant being so big and so close to the camera. And then for this branch with these leaves, first I duplicate the vine and 1 leaf from the pumpkin and I place them closer to the camera. I made some changes to the branch in edit mode so it wasn't so obvious it was the vine from the pumpkin. I duplicated the leaf and I placed it on the opposite side. And if you like, you could edit the shape of this leaf since it looked a bit too chunky. But I was feeling lazy, so I just left it as it was in the final render. And then for all of this, I used the same material as for the 2 big leaves. And for the rendering, like I said, I chose cycles, and I usually disable the noise, and I chose something like 150 samples, but it looked decent at even 50 samples. I changed the color management to medium-low contrast, since I felt the colors were a bit too saturated, and you could even render it in Eevee. There are several in-depth tutorials on how to make Eevee look more like cycles, but basically you just have to enable all of this stuff, play around with the settings, of course, to see what looks best. And if you're rendering in Eevee, I suggest you use a different f-stop because 1.8 might be too blurred in Eevee. And that's it for today's video. I hope you have enjoyed this autumn character. If you like more simple character tutorials like this one, and if you'd like me to rig and animate this character for beginners, let me know in the comments. Remember, you can get the blend file to support the channel. There are other ways to support the channels, all links are in the description, and also you can subscribe and like this video, that makes a big difference already. And if you like this video, you're probably gonna enjoy this one. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!